They laughed when a retired SWAT officer chose a cave over a house. They called him paranoid, obsolete, crazy. Then winter came harder than anyone remembered. And when the town began to freeze, he was the only one who had prepared. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. We're so curious about it. And if this story touches your heart, please make sure to subscribe for more. Your support truly means the world. Winter arrived early in the northern mountains, not with drama, but with a quiet certainty, as if the cold had already decided who would endure and who would not. Daniel Harris felt it in his bones long before the snow began to fall. At 63, Daniel no longer measured time by calendars or seasons, but by pain. The dull ache in his left knee from a bad landing during a forced entry 20 years ago. The stiffness in his right shoulder where a steel door frame had collapsed during a hostage rescue, and the deeper, heavier weight behind his eyes that came from memories that refused to fade. He had been a SWAT officer for over 3 decades, the kind who spoke little, trained hard, and survived situations that killed men younger and stronger than him. When he finally retired, there was no ceremony, no speeches, no sense of closure, just a box with his badge, a folded flag he didn't feel he deserved, and silence. The city had become unbearable after that. Sirens felt like accusations, crowds felt hostile. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by dreams that snapped him awake with his heart racing, his hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that was no longer there. So Daniel left. He bought a small, aging log cabin tucked into the mountains of the northern United States, far from highways and farther still from people who asked questions. The cabin was plain, weathered gray by decades of snow and wind, its roof patched and reinforced by Daniel's own hands. He liked it that way. It didn't pretend to be anything more than shelter. The only living being who followed him there without hesitation was Rex, a German shepherd just past 7 years old, his black and tan coat thick and well-kept, his muzzle beginning to show threads of gray. Rex had the long, lean build of a working dog, muscles earned through years of discipline rather than play, amber-brown eyes alert but calm, the kind that missed nothing and panicked at nothing. He wasn't officially a police dog, but Daniel had trained him with the same precision he once trained rookies: clear commands, consistent routines, trust earned through action, not affection. Rex rarely barked. When he did, Daniel listened. Life in the mountains followed a rhythm Daniel understood. Chop wood, check supplies, repair what the weather tried to destroy. Walk the perimeter with Rex in the mornings, the dog trotting slightly ahead, nose low, ears rotating like radar. The town nearest to Daniel's land was small, the kind of place where everyone knew your name before they knew your story. When Daniel first arrived, people watched him from porches and gas station windows. He was tall, broad-shouldered despite age, his posture straight in a way that came from habit rather than pride. His hair was steel gray, cropped short, his face angular and lined, with a trimmed beard that hid a scar along his jaw. His eyes were pale blue, distant but not unfriendly, eyes that had learned to measure people quickly and then move on. He spoke politely but briefly, didn't linger, didn't explain. That alone was enough to earn him a reputation. What sealed it was the cave. Less than 100 yards uphill from Daniel's cabin, partially concealed by pine and stone, was a natural limestone cave that opened into the mountainside like a dark, patient mouth. Long ago, prospectors had surveyed it, cleared loose rock, mapped its main chamber, and then abandoned it when the land proved unprofitable. Daniel didn't see a curiosity or a relic. He saw geometry, airflow, elevation. He saw stone that had stood unmoved for thousands of years. To him, the cave wasn't primitive. It was strategic. He spent months studying it, moving carefully through its interior with a headlamp and measuring tools, testing air quality, marking stable load points, listening for shifts in stone. The main chamber was high and dry, the ceiling naturally arched, the floor elevated enough that meltwater flowed past rather than through it. Daniel reinforced where necessary, not to change the cave, but to respect its limits. He installed simple shelving, cleared sleeping space, and marked natural ventilation paths. To the people in town, it looked like paranoia. "Man's hiding from something," one of them said. "Or planning for the end of the world," another joked. Daniel heard none of it directly, but he knew. He had learned long ago that mockery often came from fear disguised as confidence. Rex adjusted to the cave instinctively. Animals understood shelter without philosophy. The dog paced the interior once, sniffed the stone walls, then lay down near the entrance passage, positioning himself where he could see both inside and out. Daniel noticed and nodded. That night, as the temperature dropped sharply and the wind began to push against the mountain, Daniel sat alone in his cabin, oil lamp burning low, hands wrapped around a mug that had gone cold. He thought about the men he'd lost, about the calls he'd answered too late, about the quiet that followed violence and never quite left. He thought about how many times he'd trusted structures that failed under pressure, doors, walls, plans built on assumptions instead of reality. Outside, snow began to fall, light at first, then heavier, coating the ground in white that reflected the moon like bone. Daniel stood, joints protesting, and pulled on his coat. Rex was already at the door, waiting. Together, they stepped into the cold, the dog's breath puffing steadily, Daniel's slower, measured. He looked up toward the cave, dark against the snow, solid and unmoving. "Soon," he murmured, not to Rex but to the winter itself. He wasn't running from the world. He was preparing to outlast it. Daniel Harris had learned long ago that preparation was a lonely act. In his years with SWAT, the men who survived weren't the loudest or the bravest, but the ones who planned quietly while others joked. That instinct returned as the cold deepened. Each morning, before the sun climbed over the ridgeline, Daniel pulled on his heavy coat and walked the short trail between the cabin and the cave, Rex moving beside him with measured steps, his breath steady in the freezing air. Inside the cave, Daniel worked methodically. He brought in a compact gas analyzer, its screen glowing faintly as he checked oxygen levels and traced airflow with slow, practiced movements of his hand. The cave breathed like a living thing, drawing air in through a narrow upper fissure and releasing it through a lower channel Daniel had cleared weeks earlier. He reinforced the ceiling only where the stone demanded it, using steel braces anchored into load-bearing points, never forcing the cave to become something it wasn't. Rex watched from the side, ears swiveling, occasionally lifting his head when a distant crack echoed through the rock. The dog was all muscle and restraint, his coat thick enough to shed snow easily, his eyes alert without nervousness. Daniel trusted Rex's instincts more than most instruments. When Rex stiffened, Daniel paused. When the dog relaxed, Daniel continued. Supplies came next. Daniel stacked firewood deep inside the cave where moisture couldn't reach it, arranging logs by size the way he once arranged gear by function. Food was sealed and dated, water stored in insulated containers, lamps checked and rechecked. He prepared redundancy because he knew failure rarely announced itself politely. One afternoon, while inspecting the upper ventilation path, Daniel felt the subtle wrongness beneath his boot. The stone shifted, not enough to collapse, but enough to warn. He crouched, knee protesting sharply as weight settled on old damage, and brushed away loose gravel to reveal a partially collapsed airflow channel, likely weakened by decades of freeze and thaw. Fixing it couldn't wait. Daniel spent hours in the cold, fingers numb despite gloves, clearing debris and reinforcing the narrow passage with careful precision. Halfway through, his left knee buckled without warning, pain flaring white-hot up his leg. He froze, breathing through it, sweat cooling instantly against his spine. Rex was at his side in seconds, pressing close, his body solid and warm. Daniel rested a hand against the dog's neck until the pain dulled to something manageable. Not today, he muttered, whether to his knee or the mountain itself, he wasn't sure. The repair held. Air moved cleanly again, steady and reliable. That night, Daniel limped into town for supplies he couldn't carry easily. The general store smelled of dust and coffee. Behind the counter stood Mark Ellis, a broad man in his late 50s with a graying beard and permanently raised eyebrows, a look shaped by years of watching storms come and go without ever truly fearing them. "You settling in for hibernation already?" Mark asked with a half-smile, eyes flicking to Rex, who lay calmly by the door. Daniel returned the look without humor. "Just preparing." A couple of men near the shelves laughed quietly. One of them, taller and leaner, wore a jacket too thin for the cold and confidence like armor. "Heard you're fixing up that old cave," the man said. "What is this, Stone Age survival?" Daniel paid, nodded once, and left. Outside, the wind had sharpened, cutting through fabric with intent. Rex trotted ahead, unconcerned. Back at the cabin, Daniel sat heavily at the table, knee-wrapped, hands steady despite the ache. He thought about how many times he'd heard similar laughter before missions, how often bravado replaced preparation. Most of those men were gone now. Snow began falling again, thicker this time, driven sideways by rising wind. Daniel stepped outside and studied the sky, the clouds low and bruised, pressing down on the mountains as if testing them. He moved supplies closer to the cave entrance, set markers along the path that would remain visible even under heavy snowfall, and checked his emergency signal kit one last time. Rex followed each movement, silent and attentive. When night fell, the temperature dropped hard and fast. Daniel chose the cave over the cabin, settling inside the reinforced chamber with Rex positioned near the entrance, both of them listening as the wind began to find its voice. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the storm was gathering strength. In town, lights glowed warmly, false comfort against what was coming. Daniel leaned back against the stone, feeling its cold steadiness through his coat. He had done what he could. The rest would be decided by winter. The storm announced itself without warning, not with thunder or drama, but with pressure, a crushing heaviness in the air that Daniel Harris felt deep in his chest long before the first wall of snow slammed into the mountainside. By dawn, the world outside the cave entrance had vanished behind a curtain of white fury. Wind screamed through the trees, bending them until they groaned like living things being tortured. Inside the cave, Daniel sat still, listening, counting seconds between gusts the way he once counted breaths before breaching a door. Rex lay near the entrance passage, head up, ears angled forward, his body tense but controlled. Snow drove horizontally now, piling fast enough to erase the markers Daniel had placed along the trail. Visibility dropped to nothing. The temperature plummeted with violent speed, far faster than any normal winter storm. Daniel checked his thermometer and exhaled slowly. This wasn't bad weather. This was a killer blizzard. He moved deeper into the cave, sealing the partial windbreak he had prepared, careful not to block airflow. The cave responded as it always had, absorbing the chaos outside with ancient indifference. The temperature inside remained steady, cold but survivable. Daniel lit the small iron stove, feeding it carefully, mindful of balance. Heat was life, but only when controlled. For several hours, everything held. Rex relaxed slightly, shifting position, eyes still alert. Daniel allowed himself a single measured breath of relief. Then the wind shifted. It happened subtly at first, almost imperceptible, but Daniel noticed the change in sound immediately. The roar outside altered its pitch, pushing against the mountain at a new angle. Inside the cave, the stove flame flickered strangely, bending in a way it shouldn't. Smoke hesitated at the flue, then curled back toward the chamber. Daniel's body reacted before his mind finished the thought. He moved fast, dousing the fire with practiced efficiency, hands steady despite the cold. He felt it then, the faint tightness in his chest, the slight pressure behind his eyes. Rex rose abruptly, hackles lifting, a low, unsettled whine escaping his throat. The dog coughed once, sharp and wrong. Carbon monoxide. Silent. Invisible. Daniel's pulse remained calm because panic wasted oxygen. He opened the secondary ventilation path he had reinforced weeks earlier, forcing cold air through the chamber. He grabbed his portable detector from the shelf and watched the numbers spike, then slowly begin to fall. Rex paced, agitated, nails scraping stone, eyes fixed on Daniel as if demanding action. "Easy," Daniel said quietly, though his own head throbbed now, a dull warning. He moved them both closer to the lower airflow channel, pressing Rex into a down position where the air was cleanest. Minutes stretched thin. Outside, the storm battered the mountain like it intended to tear it open. Inside, Daniel focused on Rex's breathing, steadying his own to match it. He thought of all the times he'd walked into rooms poisoned by gas, all the times he'd pulled strangers out while trusting equipment and instinct. Now there was no team, no backup, no second chance, only preparation. Eventually, the detector stabilized. The pressure in Daniel's head eased slightly. He leaned back against the stone, eyes closed, conserving strength. Rex pressed closer, his solid warmth grounding Daniel in the present. Hours passed in that suspended state. The blizzard did not weaken, it intensified. The wind screamed with such force that it found every weakness in the mountain, rattling stone and ice. Snow buried the cave entrance passage inch by inch, though the internal chamber remained protected. Daniel rationed movement, rationed light, rationed thought. He ate mechanically, drank sparingly, checked airflow obsessively. Outside, the storm showed no mercy. Somewhere beyond the mountain, the town lay exposed. Daniel knew the houses there were built for winters, not for this. He imagined chimneys choking with snow, doors frozen shut, people huddled inside walls that suddenly felt too thin. He shut the thought away. There was nothing he could do yet. Rex sensed the tension and rested his head against Daniel's leg, eyes half closed but alert. The dog trusted the cave without question. That trust cut deeper than any memory. Night came. Though inside the cave there was no true darkness, only a thickening sense of time pressing inward. The wind outside rose to a constant howling roar that vibrated through the stone. Daniel slept in short bursts, waking each time Rex shifted, or the cave spoke in low, distant cracks that never quite became collapse. On the second day, the cold grew worse. Daniel's fingers stiffened despite gloves. His knee burned constantly now, the earlier strain aggravated by tension and immobility. He welcomed the pain. Pain meant clarity. What he feared was the fog creeping back into his thoughts if the air turned again. He checked the detector every hour. The storm continued without pause. By the third day, the blizzard had become a siege. Snow pressed against the mountain with relentless weight. Daniel ventured only as far as the inner passage, never to the entrance itself. Rex remained vigilant, coughing no more, but refusing to fully relax. Then, sometime between one howling gust and the next, the sound changed. The roar softened slightly, losing its edge. Daniel opened his eyes and listened hard. The wind still screamed, but there were gaps now, brief moments where it seemed to draw breath. A lull, temporary, dangerous, but real. Daniel checked the detector one more time, secured Rex's harness, and moved with deliberate care toward the entrance passage, stopping well short of exposure. Through the narrow gap, he saw nothing but white chaos, but he felt it, the storm loosening its grip, if only for a moment. Not enough to leave, not yet, but enough to know they had survived the worst so far. He returned to the chamber and sat beside Rex, resting his hand on the dog's broad neck. "We're still here," he said quietly. Outside, the blizzard raged on, furious that it had failed to claim what it came for. The change came quietly. After days of unbroken violence, the storm did not end so much as loosen its grip, the wind losing its constant scream and breaking into uneven, exhausted gusts. Daniel Harris sensed it before he saw it. The mountain felt different. The pressure in the air eased just enough to be noticeable, like a clenched fist finally relaxing its fingers. Inside the cave, Daniel sat motionless, listening, counting again, measuring the gaps between howls. Rex lifted his head and sniffed the air, ears rotating forward then back. The dog's body language shifted from rigid vigilance to focused readiness. Not calm, not yet, but alert in a way that suggested possibility. Daniel checked the detector one more time, then the thermometer. Still brutally cold, but no longer instantly lethal. This was the window he'd been waiting for. He moved with purpose, pulling on additional layers, tightening the brace around his knee despite the sharp protest it answered with. Pain was familiar. It didn't slow him anymore. It sharpened him. Rex stood patiently as Daniel fitted his harness, fingers moving automatically through motions once used to secure vests and weapons. Outside the entrance passage, the world was unrecognizable. Snow lay in sculpted drifts taller than a man, shaped by days of relentless wind. Trees bent low, their branches locked in ice. The sky was a dull, oppressive gray that flattened depth and distance. Daniel did not step fully into the open. He stayed close to the mountain's protection, moving carefully, testing each step. Rex went first, choosing the safest path without command, his paws finding purchase where Daniel's boots slipped. Together, they descended toward the town. The trail no longer existed. What had once been familiar landmarks were buried or erased. Daniel navigated by memory and angle, by the slope of land beneath the snow and the way the wind cut around exposed rock. It took hours to travel a distance that once took minutes. As they neared the outskirts of town, the damage became clear. Houses sagged under the weight of snow. Several roofs had partially collapsed. Chimneys stood silent, some buried entirely, others blackened where smoke had failed to escape. There was no sound of engines, no voices carried by the air. The town felt stunned, as if holding its breath. Daniel approached the first house cautiously, rapping hard against the door frame. No answer. He circled to a window, brushing away snow to peer inside. Two elderly figures sat, huddled beneath blankets near a dead stove, faces pale, movements slow. Daniel forced the door open and stepped inside, cold air flooding the room. The man, thin and shaking, had a lined face and watery eyes, his beard untrimmed and frost-damp. The woman beside him was smaller, wrapped in layers that did little to stop her shivering, her gray hair pulled back tightly, her skin ashen. "Help is here," Daniel said firmly, his voice cutting through their fog. He moved fast, clearing the blocked chimney, opening a controlled airflow, then wrapping them in thermal blankets from his pack. Rex remained by the doorway, watching, alert but non-threatening. The dog's presence steadied them. Daniel did not attempt to move them immediately. He knew better. Exertion could kill them faster than cold now. He stabilized, assessed, and marked the house before moving on. The second house was worse. Mark Ellis, the store owner, lay on the floor near his counter, breathing shallowly. Up close, Mark looked older than Daniel remembered, his beard rimed with frost, skin blotched from cold exposure. Daniel knelt beside him, checking vitals, elevating Mark's legs, forcing warm air circulation without shock. Mark's eyes fluttered open, recognition sparked weakly. "The cave," he rasped. Daniel nodded once. "Later, you stay alive first." As daylight faded, Daniel made a decision. He could not bring everyone back at once. The path was too dangerous, the cold too unforgiving. Instead, he established a rotation. Those most at risk would go first. Those stable enough would shelter temporarily. He moved methodically, like he used to clear buildings, one room, one problem at a time. By the time darkness returned, Daniel had stabilized 6 people across 3 locations. He returned to the cave with Rex leading, escorting the first pair slowly, carefully, stopping often. Inside the cave, the warmth was immediate but controlled. Daniel seated them away from the airflow, monitored breathing, offered small sips of water. No one spoke much. Fear had drained them of excess words. Through the night, Daniel rested only in fragments. At dawn, he went back out. The storm had weakened further, though it still threatened. He brought more people in small groups, never exceeding what the cave could safely hold. Rex worked tirelessly, guiding, standing guard, offering quiet reassurance through his steady presence. By the 3rd trip, the town's remaining residents understood. The man they'd mocked had become the one thing between them and death. No one laughed now. No one questioned. When Daniel finally sat against the cave wall, exhaustion settling deep into his bones, Rex lay beside him, chest rising and falling in even rhythm. The instincts Daniel thought he'd left behind had never left at all. They had only been waiting for a reason to wake. The storm did not leave all at once. It retreated the way a defeated enemy does, slowly, reluctantly, stripping away its violence, but leaving scars behind. Morning light returned in pale fragments, filtered through cloud and snow, revealing what Silver Ridge had endured. Daniel Harris stood just inside the cave entrance, watching the town below emerge from white burial. Smoke rose again, thin and careful, from chimneys that still stood. Movement returned to streets that had been silent for days. Rex sat beside him, his posture relaxed for the first time since the blizzard began, ears forward but no longer tense, his tail resting against the stone. The cave behind them held quiet life, bundled figures breathing steadily, cups warming stiff hands, low voices speaking with relief instead of fear. Daniel moved among them with calm efficiency, checking vitals, adjusting blankets, rationing food without ceremony. No one argued. No one questioned. Trust had replaced disbelief completely. Later that day, Sheriff Alan Morrison arrived on snowshoes, his uniform hidden beneath heavy winter gear. He was a tall man in his early 60s, broad through the shoulders but softened by age, his dark mustache streaked with gray, his face lined by years of responsibility rather than combat. Morrison removed his gloves inside the cave and looked around slowly, taking in the stone walls, the controlled airflow, the careful organization. "You planned this," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Daniel nodded once. "Years ago," Morrison replied, shaking his head, "we thought you were hiding." "I was preparing," Daniel answered. Word spread quickly after that. The cave was no longer spoken of as a curiosity or joke. It became a point of reference, then a plan. Over the next days, Daniel coordinated controlled returns, escorting people back to their homes once it was safe, never rushing, never allowing panic to dictate decisions. Mark Ellis recovered slowly but fully, insisting on shaking Daniel's hand with both of his when he was finally warm enough to stand. "I was wrong," Mark said, voice thick. Daniel accepted the words without comment. Apologies were not why he'd done any of this. The town council met in a half-damaged hall days later. Daniel attended reluctantly, standing near the door with Rex at his side. They spoke of compensation for supplies, of formalizing the cave as an emergency shelter, of installing better markers and maintaining clear access routes. Daniel listened, offered practical suggestions, declined praise. When the meeting ended, Morrison approached him again. "You could have left," the sheriff said. "No one would have blamed you." Daniel looked out toward the mountains, the stone that had held when everything else failed. "That's not how I was trained," he said. Winter settled into something manageable after that. Repairs began, roofs were cleared, structures rebuilt smarter, lower, more sheltered. Daniel helped when asked, advised when listened to, and otherwise returned to his quiet routines. The cave remained ready, stocked and reinforced, its purpose no longer questioned. One evening, weeks later, Daniel sat outside his cabin as snow fell gently, nothing like the violence that had come before. Rex lay at his feet, older eyes half closed, content. Daniel felt the ache in his knee, the familiar stiffness, but also something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging that didn't demand explanation. He wasn't a ghost here. He wasn't a joke. He was simply a man who had understood the mountain and respected it. As darkness settled, Daniel rose and rested a hand on Rex's head. The cave stood behind them, silent and patient, waiting for whatever winter might try next. This time, no one doubted where safety lived. The lesson of this story is simple but often overlooked. Preparation is quiet. Wisdom is rarely popular, and the people who think ahead are often doubted until a crisis proves them right. In everyday life, we see the same pattern. Those who plan, learn, and respect experience are questioned while shortcuts are praised. If this story made you reflect on how prepared you really are, share it with someone who needs that wake-up call. Tell us in the comments, if you were in his place, would you trust the cave or take your chances in town, and why? And if stories like this make you think, feel, and question your own choices, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you so much for watching.